Hello, hello.
Hello,
Again.
hello. How are you tonight?
I'm doing good. We back for part 4 tonight. Oh my gosh, 4 episodes in, girl.
I'm gonna tell you right now. Don't think that you are going to sneak anything by me because I have my pen and my paper.
You are ready.
I am ready. You are not going to sneak anything by me. I'm going to write down, and if you leave something out, I'm going to ask you about it.
She said, "I am legal assistant secretary ready."
That's right. Absolutely.
Well, y'all, welcome back to another fabulous week of the Monroe Files. Like we said, this is part 4. We are everything vaguely paranormal. My name is Blake Smith, and my wonderful, fabulous special guest this whole little mini series, Miss Shelley Pruitt.
Thank you. Hello.
Also my partner in the paranormal.
Absolutely.
And why not? We'll just shout it out. Happy birthday, Ryan. We wish you could be here.
Happy birthday, Ryan.
So tonight we are going to delve back into the night that Marilyn died. Now, but what I'm going to add in on this, I know you're so ready. So ready. I'm going to add in on this everything that basically has been said since the night she died in interviews and with the press, with the media, with investigators, all the way up to as recent as 2018.
Ooh.
Yes. So
very quick question.
Okay.
Did you ever get that FBI file verified?
Okay. So I went to go look for it, did all my little research on it, all that stuff. And yes, it was a very damning FBI document, quote unquote. But I think the conclusion that I have come to is there was a 70-page pamphlet that was released shortly after Marilyn Monroe's death by Frank Capel, I believe was his name. And I think it was entitled The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe. And around that time, Bobby Kennedy had said anything that relates to him or Marilyn Monroe or anything like that. He wrote a memo to the FBI saying, I want it all sent to my house or sent to my office. And I've kind of matched up some of the dialogue that's in the FBI document versus what the pamphlet states.
So you guys are going to get to hear what that document says then.
I think that it is a transcript of that document.
Perfect.
So I don't know the validity to that.
Because at this point, it could have been altered because of where it went first.
It could have been. I will say this. I would love to say that it's factual. I would love to read it and say these are facts that we're going off of. But I myself feel like there's some discrepancy to it. So I don't want to throw that out there and say this is fact. This is a document just because it's an FBI document. You know, first and foremost, full transparency on that. So
okay.
So get you caught up to speed. If this is just your first one watching, make sure you go back and watch the final 3 because on the 6th one, we are actually going to go and do a live discussion about the previous 5 weeks. And we want your input
because, Chad, I'm going to argue with Blake. I need y'all to help.
I know she will. So to kind of get you caught up to speed, what we've covered in the past 3 episodes, we've learned of shady dealings with the Kennedys and the mafia, Marilyn Monroe's affair with RFK and JFK, JFK and Bobby Kennedy's loose lips with Marilyn, the fact that she knew state secrets, she was blabbing all of this, the lost weekend where she was taken advantage of at the Calneva Lodge, and her vengeful mentality, very determined and motivated to seek this revenge and oust them and their affairs and all of this stuff.
Who they really were.
Exactly. And we also saw, we went through the original timeline that was given to Jack Clemens and some of the other investigators that arrived on the scene. Some of it already didn't make sense. Even 2 hours later, we already saw that. The autopsy, we followed through with that. We went well in depth with that about why it seemed so freaking fishy and didn't make sense. And basically, that's where we're going to pick back up. Well, actually, I take that back. We went through the quote unquote formal, I say that with a lot of sarcasm, investigation that was 15 days long. And it led to 1 interview and about 7,000 press conferences that like, we're doing our job. And in fact, I'm sorry, but they weren't. And their conclusion was probable suicide by the end of it. They made her out to be this damsel in distress that needed rescuing, and the rescuer never came. And frankly, it kind of pisses me off. But anyways.
Me too.
All of that, if you've really paid attention to the last 3 episodes, begs the biggest question to me is why 7 diverse individuals that this starts with, which is an actor, a housekeeper, a psychiatrist, a press agent, an attorney, a physician, and a handyman, collaborate together to conceal the truth for the time that they did, remember, we're talking about new interviews, regarding the circumstances of Marilyn Monroe's death. That's the biggest question to me. Why? The vital thing to remember in all of this, there is no smoking gun. We don't have a smoking gun. So this is probably Hollywood's biggest circumstantial case if we're ever going to have one. So I'd like to delve back into the night that Marilyn died, Marilyn's final day, and reiterate that timeline with you. However, it's going to be altered from the original version of what you heard. So we start the day off with, we know, and I made this correction already, that Pat Newcomb called stay the night on August the 3rd with Marilyn. That's not contested. Pat herself has said, yes, I stayed. Sorry, I totally just derailed my train of thought. Anyways, jumping back on. So we go through August. Did you ever just brain fart out like that? So we wake up on August the 4th. Marilyn has not been to sleep yet. Pat Newcomb is still asleep in the guest room, the telephone room. And this is when the telephone calls start with Marilyn. The first one is allegedly to an actress by the name of Jean Carmen. Now, Jean Carmen, used to be a former neighbor of Marilyn's and is an alleged friend as well. And she said that Marilyn called her at around 6 a.m. that morning, woke her up, said that she woke her up and wanted to know if she'd be able to come and basically hang out with her. This is a picture of Jean Carmen here.
Oh, she's stunning. She looks like a Marilyn Monroe wannabe.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. So Jean basically says, no, I can't. I've got a lot of plans today. So
I'm meeting up with the Kennedy brothers. And,
yeah,
not really.
I'm going to have to pass. So now at this time on this day, Marilyn knew, just because of media and stuff like that, that Bobby and Ethel Kennedy were staying in California at this time at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. That is not contested either. There is media coverage of all of that. And according to a lady, her name is Elizabeth Fancher. She is a former assistant to a New York Daily reporter whose name is Flora Belle Muir. So Flora Belle Muir had attempted to recreate Marilyn's final days, and she ends up paying an operator at the St. Francis Hotel where Bobby Kennedy was staying for information. Was told that Marilyn had called Bobby Kennedy several times during the day on Friday, August the 3rd, and left messages. And according to the operator, the calls were never returned. Well, that night, August the 3rd, we're backing up. Sorry. We may be all over the place a little bit tonight. So that night on August the 3rd, drunk, Marilyn calls back the hotel one more time and leaves another message. And what takes place afterwards are this series of anonymous phone calls to Marilyn's house from a woman who kept repeating, "Leave Bobby alone, you tramp. Leave Bobby alone." And they didn't stop until about roughly 5:30 in the morning. This is the reason why Marilyn could not sleep. And according to Eunice Murray, she stated, quote, "I don't remember what time the call came in, and I don't know who it was from when she answered one of these phone calls."
Yeah, there wasn't any of that caller ID and that kind of crap. If you could call and say, "Is your refrigerator running?" Ha, 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 and hang up. You can call them back 100 times. They would still not know what number you were calling.
Yeah. Yeah. And we learned from the last episode that we don't have phone records. The phone records were seized. We know that they were taken, which there'll be more in-depth coverage on that in a little bit. So at this point, we're going off statements who people who allege to be.
The housekeeper says that the phone's ringing off the hook all night. They don't know who it is, but they're saying, "Leave Bobby alone, you tramp."
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So according to Jean, Marilyn sounded nervous and exhausted, begged her to come over, like I said, and keep her company. And she remembered Marilyn saying something along the lines of, quote, "Bring a bag of pills," to which she assumed Marilyn was talking about uppers, like I said, she declined. She said, "No, I got all this stuff I got to do." So at 8 a.m. on August 4th is when the housekeeper, Eunice Murray, arrives to work. And shortly after that, her son-in-law and handyman, Norman Jeffries, arrives between 8 and 8:30. And he immediately goes to the kitchen and begins working on the kitchen tile because the house is being remodeled at this time. Now, Jeffries remembers that shortly after 9 a.m., Marilyn emerged from her bedroom and walked into the kitchen. Now, there are two scenarios that emerge here from different sources, depending on which ones you're reading. Scenario one has Marilyn walking into the kitchen for coffee and retiring back to her bedroom. However, there's a second scenario that was later said, has Marilyn walking into the kitchen where she actually sits down at the table with Eunice Murray, and this is per Eunice Murray. And according to her in a 1974 interview, quote, had some grapefruit juice. Marilyn liked juice, as you know, but she didn't have any appetite that day. She didn't have anything to eat, and Murray was very adamant that Marilyn, quote, did not consume any food or liquor that day. She was very adamant in 1974 in this interview.
So Eunice Murray says that she drank grapefruit juice. Now, we know, being a little bit more advanced in the sciences, grapefruit juice can do some jacked up things with your system interacting with the wrong drug. In fact, a lot of medicine today will say, do not take with grapefruit juice.
Yeah.
Or that's a big deal now. There's some bad interactions. Huh.
Yeah.
Never heard this part of the story.
Yeah. So, and this is also kind of a fact that could corroborate Dr. Engelberg's comment about having to give her an injection because she was fighting bouts of diarrhea and colitis at the time. I mean, if she doesn't have an appetite, she's only drinking juice, all that stuff. Okay, that can corroborate that. It's during the morning time that Marilyn's masseuse, Ralph Roberts, he ends up calling to check tentative dinner plans that they had, which he recalled Marilyn stated she may not be able to make it and to call her back in the afternoon. And according to, I'm giving you kind of details of who shows up to the house right now. So according to Eunice Murray, again, after this phone call is when photographer Larry Schiller shows up to discuss with Marilyn about the possibility of placing the nude swimming photos from Something's Gotta Give into Playboy and being the center, being the cover photo again. He recalls pulling up to the house and seeing Marilyn bent over in the flower bed, either plucking flowers or pulling weeds. And when he called to her, she seemed happy, upbeat. She trotted over to his car, greet him and all that kind of stuff. And so Eunice Murray says that Pat Newcomb rose around 12 p.m. that day and emerged from the telephone room, which we know was across the hall from Marilyn's room. And when Newcomb walked into the kitchen, she encountered Marilyn and had what Newcomb stated in 1974 was a small argument due to her ability to sleep through the night and Marilyn not being able to get in.
They were crabby with each other.
Correct. Yeah.
And they had a little spat.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and we know that the phone calls is what Marilyn was being kept awake. I can't speak. Let me.
That's okay. The phone calls that Marilyn had been getting all night long from whoever this anonymous person was calling her a tramp, staying with Bobby, that had kept her awake all night. Probably had pissed her off because they wouldn't quit calling. She goes into the kitchen. She hasn't been able to sleep. Perhaps has coffee and returns back to her room, or perhaps has grapefruit juice and talks to the housekeeper for a minute. Either way, here comes Pat Newcomb. They have this little spat.
Yeah. Yes. Correct. And according to Norman Jeffries, again, the handyman, the argument was actually this loud, vitriolic confrontation that Eunice Murray claimed to not have heard. It was a confrontation of a continuation argument that they had the previous night over Newcomb's loyalty to the Kennedys. And this is per Norman Jeffries.
So the argument wasn't over whether or not who could sleep and who couldn't.
Correct. Because if you think about it, remember, she invited Newcomb over to get rest and sunbathe in the back because Newcomb wasn't feeling well. So why would she argue with her about being able to sleep 15 hours if that's what she invited her over to her house to do? So it makes much more. And
Marilyn Monroe had already been harassed all night long by somebody who's dropping the Kennedy name.
Yeah, exactly. So what had ended up happening prior to the phone calls coming through in the early hour mornings of August the 4th was that on August the 3rd, Marilyn was led to believe that Bobby Kennedy was going to be making an appearance at Lawford's house for a party. And in a last-ditch effort of trying to understand why he cut her off, she was wanting to see him and basically confront him. Well, when he failed to show, Marilyn basically decided, you know what, fuck it, I'll get intoxicated or inebriated. And Peter Lawford and Pat Newcomb take her to La Scala, I believe was the restaurant, where she was very drunk and inebriated. And one of her costume designers on 8 films actually saw her there, Billy Trevita.
And this is on the 3rd?
This is on the 3rd, yes.
Thank you. Just want to keep my timeline straight.
This is
so
when
she got a little
argument
worked up,
begins.
a little out of line at the restaurant, and Okay, on August the 3rd. Okay.
Correct. And Billy here, that's pictured, recalls that she appeared heavily drugged or intoxicated to the point where she didn't even recognize him. He says, quote, she looked up at me with no recognition at all. So when Marilyn and Pat Newcomb, get back home to Marilyn's house, that's where the argument is said to have begun. And from what I can only assume was probably somebody who's drunk and inebriated going, nah, screw it. I'm going to call him. I'm going to call him right now.
And somebody's going, no, you're not. Go to bed. You're done.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it in the morning. You're not doing anything tonight. Don't push it. Just go to bed.
Exactly. And I think Newcomb was attempting to thwart that decision. So I think that that's where the argument started and why it started. But we know from the operator at the St. Francis Hotel that Marilyn did call back drunk that night and left one last message.
Right.
So in later years, what's interesting is that Eunice Murray would actually go on to refute her original claim and instead admitted that there had been a major disagreement between Marilyn Monroe and Pat Newcomb. So after this argument, Eunice Murray states that Marilyn didn't eat lunch or dinner, and instead, that's when she retired to her bedroom. And she goes on and says that when Pat Newcomb was leaving the house around 1 p.m., she called out to her and asked if she had had any lunch. She says, quote, I called to her asking if she wanted something to eat. She said she did, and I fixed her one of my omelets. However, Pat Newcomb had at one time stated that she had a big displeasure with Eunice Murray. She didn't like her. And this is an actual quote from Pat Newcomb. It says, quote, Marilyn sought her advice because she was supposed to be this wonderful housekeeper Greenson had found for her. But from day one, I did not trust Eunice Murray, who seemed to be always snooping around. I tried to stay out of her way because I just didn't like her. She was sort of a spook, always hovering, always on the fringe of things. I think Miss Murray should have been hung up by her thumbs.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So why would she go back in to sit down to have a lovely lunch with someone she despised? And that sounds like she despises her.
Well, this is where you have one of the biggest inconsistencies with Marilyn's final day, as well as the autopsy, because Newcomb says in a 1974 interview, quote, Miss Murray fixed Marilyn and I lunch. They were hamburgers. And when asked and pushed further, but you remember that you and Marilyn ate together, she said, yes, at lunchtime. So it wasn't a slip up or anything like that. It was she, when she confronted about it again, she said, yes, we ate and they were hamburgers.
Wait, Marilyn says that? No, who says
no,
this?
That's Newcomb, Pat Newcomb.
Pat Newcomb says this, even though she says earlier that they ate an omelet? Or that was Eunice Murray that said
Eunice Murray fixed Pat Newcomb an omelet.
Allegedly. But Pat Newcomb says, no. We had a hamburger for lunch. We'd worked it out. All was well and good.
And Eunice Murray states that Marilyn didn't eat or drink anything that day. So you have some inconsistencies that are happening here with these stories.
Okay.
And it's just it gets even more tangled later on.
Okay.
So after lunch and after this major disagreement, Pat Newcomb decides to actually stay at Marilyn's house for a little bit longer later into the afternoon. Murray said that she placed a call to Dr. Greenson earlier that day because Marilyn had inquired about if they had any oxygen in the house. She said she asked Dr. Greenson, quote, what's this about oxygen? To which he replied, I'm not sure. I'll be over later this afternoon. Now, around this time, the time that this call is placed in the later hours mornings of August the 4th, a helicopter, we're going to jump stories here. We're not at Marilyn's house anymore. We're going to go over to Fox Studios. A helicopter has received clearance to land at Fox Studios heliport, according to
2-3 a.m. in the morning of August 4th.
No.
Early.
No. This is 11 o'clock in the morning, roughly about.
Okay.
August the 4th.
I thought you said early morning hours. Okay, so mid morning on August the 4th, the day of her alleged death.
Correct.
Okay, so a helicopter lands. At around 11 a.m.
At Fox Studios, and that is recorded on the studio's security logs and by eyewitness of a Fox security guard. And there's also a studio publicist whose name is Frank Neal, who was working at the studio that day, and he was actually surprised to see who stepped off the helicopter was Bobby Kennedy. And he got into a waiting limousine. Now, Bobby Kennedy was not supposed to be in town. He was supposed to be in San Francisco at St. Francis Hotel because he was speaking at the Bar Association that weekend. However, Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates, pictured here, states, quote, the truth is we knew Robert Kennedy was in town on August the 4th, which is a claim that's also corroborated by a former Los Angeles Mayor Sam Yorty, when he says, quote, "I had a conversation with Chief Parker, and he told me himself that Robert Kennedy had arrived in Los Angeles that day and checked into the Beverly Hilton Hotel."
That's hearsay. A lawyer would say that's hearsay. That's somebody telling a story that was told to them. But the police chief that says he said it, he saw him, that one's credible.
So his assistant, actually, whose name is Thomas Redden, who also later became, I believe, chief of police. I don't remember. Anyways, he says himself, quote, "It was reported to me by security officers that the attorney general was in Los Angeles on the weekend when Marilyn Monroe died." So he is also saying, so that's another one. And then finally, after 23 years, Eunice Murray comes forward and she changes her story to say,
I gotta tell you right now, you can't trust her. Go ahead.
that she says Robert Kennedy was in town that day as well, by saying the following, quote, "I was not supposed to know the Kennedys were a very important part of Marilyn's life, but over a period of time, I was a witness to what was happening." When asked if Bobby Kennedy had been to Marilyn's house that day, Eunice Murray replied, quote, "Oh, sure, yes. I was in the living room when he arrived. She was not dressed." Norman Jeffries, the handyman, who denied being present at the house, finally confirmed that not only had he not left Eunice Murray's side that weekend, but also the presence of Bobby Kennedy at Marilyn's house. Now, him saying that Bobby Kennedy was there is 30 years later. This is about 1993.
When
Norman
everything
Jeffries
kind of died down and there wasn't as much heat on him, he finally decides to say something.
Mm-hmm.
That to me gives him just a little bit more credibility because he didn't want to be in the well, everything was going on. He just didn't want nothing to do with it. But now he's asked and he says, "Yeah, okay, yeah, I was there, and yeah, he showed up."
Mm-hmm. He states he states he was loading up tools and preparing to leave after lunch when Eunice Murray came to him and told Norman Jeffries that she had been let go. So he stayed on and began packing her things for her and loading them in the truck. Yes.
Did he see Kennedy before or after lunch?
After lunch. This is now all after lunch. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so while he's loading his tools and Eunice Murray is fired, now why she don't get the hell out? If you've been fired, why the hell don't you get the hell out of the house? Because if I fire you, go ahead and take off.
I think it's because Bobby Kennedy showed up.
So that's what I'm trying to figure out. What's this window here?
We are in between. We are in between the time of the 1 p.m. I fixed her an omelet story.
Okay.
And the 4:30 time frame of Dr. Greenson showing up. That's
so we're between 1 and 4:30 on August the 4th.
Correct.
Okay.
Now he also asked Eunice Murray if he had been let go as well, to which she just replied, "You're going to have to speak with Marilyn. I don't know." So now, give you a little bit more of your time frame. Around 3 to 4 p.m. is when Norman Jeffries states that Bobby Kennedy showed up with Peter Lawford to the house. This is also the moment when I know the highly contested tapes, the Fred Otash tapes and Bernard Spindle tapes, they're one and the same. They were working together. Caught the conversation or the argument of the voices between Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. Now, Bernard Spindle, this is Fred Otash right here. Throw a picture.
And is he the person that had her house bugged, correct?
Correct. Fred Otash.
One of the many.
Yeah, one of the many. Yeah, allegedly that had her house bugged. Now, this is Fred Otash. This is a picture of Bernard Spindle, wonderfully with Jimmy Hoffa.
Of course.
Of course he is. So Bernard Spindle, I know we talked about Fred Otash in the past. So Bernard Spindle, he was an American surveillance, wiretapping, electronics, and lockpicking expert and generally regarded as the best in his field, and a pilot. I always like to it's like ... and a pilot. So
one of these jobs seems more credible than the others.
Yeah. So a little bit. But he says, or he leads Anthony Summers. We've talked about Anthony Summers quite a bit. Anthony Summers is the man who did a lot of interviewing, roughly about 650 people in the early 80s whenever they reopened the case into Marilyn Monroe's death after 20 years she had passed. They're like, we're going to put this to rest. And Anthony Summers, pictured here, interviewed 650 people, hours upon hours of interviews, and it's the documentary that is now on Netflix, The Unheard Tapes of Marilyn Monroe. He is led in 1985 by an NBC News executive named Mark Monsky, to a government contact who allegedly had heard 40 minutes of the Otesh Spindle tapes. Now, this contact states, quote, "You could hear Marilyn and Kennedy talking. It was kind of echoey and at a distance, as though the sound was in a room next to the side of the transmitter, perhaps in some sort of hallway."
That's what I was going to say. Was it in a hallway?
Their voices grew louder and louder. They were arguing about something that had been promised to Robert Kennedy. As they argued, their voices got shriller. If I had not recognized RFK's voice already, I'm not sure I would have known it was him at this point. He was screeching high-pitched like an old lady. He was asking again and again, "Where is it? Where the fuck is it?" And he says a third voice was heard on the tape that came in, and that he alleged to be Peter Lawford's voice saying, "Calm down and calm down." This is the one where apparently and allegedly Marilyn lunged at Robert Kennedy with a knife. I'm going to go ahead and go on record right now and say that I have checked into the validity of this, and I cannot 100% guarantee and say that this is a factual finding. And this is
number one, if she's in a hallway or in a bedroom, where the hell is she going to get a knife?
Right.
Let's just go ahead and throw that out there. Now, she might have lunged at him. That little with the knife part might be a tad bit embellished, because you see, at that point, he would have attacked the Attorney General of the United States, the president's brother, and they could put her in jail and throw her in a hole somewhere that nobody could ever get to her at.
Yeah. Yep. And I also, this is the only thing, and this is why I say I like to investigate this, because to be an investigator on something, you have to look at both sides, not just what agrees with you in your opinion. What I don't like here is that Anthony Summers says that he interviewed this person who heard supposedly and allegedly 40 minutes of this tape. However, he meets this contact in the 1980s. And supposedly in 1966, supposedly in 1966, there was a raid on Bernard Spindle's home because he got mixed up in a 1955 illegal wiretapping shit.
Shock.
Yeah, that these tapes then disappeared. They were taken and they were destroyed. So there's not a timeline of when this person heard these tapes, and you're in the 1980s now. So it's questionable as to where they really heard by this person, and it's an anonymous government contact, quote unquote, which, may lend some credibility to it by putting government contact in there, but it's anonymous. He's never named, or they're never named.
Yeah, but the thing that blew the whole lid off the Watergate, the break into the Democratic headquarters was the Deep Throat guy. That was an anonymous government contact that was giving Woodward and Bernstein the information so that they could figure out what was going on. So that anonymous contact, I'm with you, but how old, this person who says that he heard them, how old could this person must have been, or how old were they? Yeah. Now, could he have heard them when they first got there? Maybe. I would think that it is very possible that you have something as valuable as the Attorney General screaming at the biggest star in the world at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think you're going to make a copy of that?
I'm
going to make a copy of it.
I'm going to make a copy of it. And then I'm going to
know somebody's going to want
it. The highest bidder.
And I'm going to mail it. I'm going to make a copy and I'm going to mail it to someone and say, hey, you might be getting a package from me, but I'm going to mail out like 10 packages. So you don't know who's going to get it. You can hunt them all down if you want to. But that person that gets it is going to be instructed to mail it somewhere else.
Yeah.
I would be a great spy.
So the contact goes on to say that Robert Kennedy was heard saying, quote, "We have to know. It's important to the family. We can make any arrangements you want." Says that the source, the source states that the voices got closer and closer. Heard some clacking around, like they were moving hangers in a closet. There was screaming going on with Marilyn telling them to get the hell out. And finally, obviously, they were trying to look for something, supposedly. And finally, you hear a door slam, and that's where the argument ends.
Are we thinking that could be the Red Diary?
Well, that's what I was just about to say, because what adds a little bit of credence to this, if somebody is looking for something, this goes back to what Fred Otesh and Mickey Song, the hairstylist who did Marilyn's hair at the Happy Birthday, Mr. President gala, says that they both knew that Marilyn was bugging herself. She was recording herself on her own tape recorders, which is also discussed in a previous episode between Dr. Greenson and John Miner when they had their interview during the formal investigation, that Marilyn was tape recording herself. And that supposedly that's what they were looking for, was this tape recorder to make sure that they didn't have any dirt, or she didn't have any dirt on.
You know what? I don't
Bobby
give
Kennedy.
a damn who you are. You come up in my house and start rifling through my crap, and I'm calling the cops. I'm calling law, and I'm letting everybody know you there. Get out.
Yeah. And you have a couple of other people. You have Earl J. Cox, who was Bernard Spindle's aide, said he also heard some of these tapes, as well as Spindle's former employee and a Washington attorney, Michael Morrissey, who stated to have heard them. And Spindle's doctor says that Spindle talked to him many times about these tapes that he had of Marilyn Monroe. He did not hear them, but he had talked to him many times. So you actually have a couple of people who are coming forward and saying, no, I've heard these tapes, or I know of these tapes. It's not just one person.
But again, there very well may be multiple people that know about these tapes, and the reason for that being, the mob was bugging her, the FBI was bugging her, the Kennedys were bugging her. She was recording things into this. The Otesh guy was bugging her. She was like freaking YouTube before YouTube ever happened. Everybody was listening to her damn conversation.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah.
So could there be multiple originals of this tape just in different locations? I think it is totally credible that someone that isn't related to the Kennedys could have heard these tapes. Someone that the Kennedys maybe couldn't get to, like the mafia, could have copies of these tapes and could have said, hey, you know what, you behave, you be a good boy, and these will never see the light of day. That's mobster for you right there.
That's so true. So I already told you about the 1966 raid on Spindle's home. Now he actually says that because Bobby was getting prepared for his candidacy at this point, 1966, and he actually tells Spindle tells Life magazine reporter John Neary, quote, Hogan really did Kennedy a favor by pulling that raid. They stole my tapes on Marilyn and my complete file. Now, I do find it interesting that Spindle and his wife, and then his widow, after he passed away, went through the process of litigation to try and get these contents of this raid back, to which they were told they don't exist anymore. The FBI destroyed them. You know, too bad, so sad, basically.
The FBI don't destroy shit.
The FBI tried to say that they regularly cleaned out and destroyed Spindle's file.
But they don't anymore.
But they don't. So that is the presence of Bobby Kennedy showing up at the house, as told by multiple different people in these alleged tapes. Now, what I find very interesting is in a 1984 interview, there's a gentleman, his name is Sidney Gilleroff. Now, Sidney Gilleroff had been Marilyn's hairstylist for, basically, he says he was there for her entire career. He was there from the start all the way to the end. And he refused to reveal contents of conversation that he had had with Marilyn, beyond saying that Marilyn was just, quote, upset and depressed. Now, that was in 1984. Now, 11 years go by, and in 1995, he's in another interview, and he stated for the first time that he had actually spoken to Marilyn twice on that Saturday. And the first quote says, quote, this is Gilleroff, Marilyn phoned me, was in an absolute state. She was in tears, and I had difficulty understanding her, and I calmed her down and said something like, now what's the matter, dear? She said, Bobby Kennedy was here, and he threatened me, screamed at me, and pushed me around. I think I said something like, what was Robert Kennedy doing at your house? Because I couldn't believe my ears. I knew absolutely nothing about her affair with Bobby, and I thought I knew everything. I knew about Jack, but she told me she had an affair with Bobby as well as Jack, and everything had gone wrong. Now she was afraid and felt she was in terrible danger. Bobby felt she had become a problem and had said to her, quote, if you threaten me, Marilyn, there's more than one way to keep you quiet, end quote. Now, that is in an interview with Sidney Gilleroff, the hairdresser. That's in 1995. When he
this occurs sometime after 4 p.m. because we know that, again, taking notes. We know that Bobby Kennedy shows up sometime between 3 and 4. Or we're going to say there's enough corroborating evidence as far as what I've heard in eyewitness statements that I believe that Bobby Kennedy did show up there. So how do you spell his name? Gilleroff. So Gilleroff says that he has 2 calls from her that day. What is this the first one?
This is the first one.
Okay, so that has to be sometime. And if she's that upset, it has to be pretty close. If we know that the doctor shows up around
there. We're getting there.
Okay.
We're getting there.
Okay, so we're going to say it's
Don't
after
jump
4
me.
p.m. I'm working on my timeline.
We're in between 3 and 4 p.m. right now.
Okay.
We're getting closer to 4 p.m. with all
Okay.
of
So
this going on
Gilleruff
and this
is
phone
called.
call.
Okay.
Yes. So now, after all this goes down, here's your continuation of the timeline. Norman Jeffries and Eunice Murray returned to the house at approximately 4:30 after being told to go to the market when Lawford and Kennedy arrived. Basically, leave now, get out. Like,
but they were fired. Why would they go to the market? They should have left.
Because if they didn't leave in that time and these two guys show up and they're like, get the hell out, go somewhere.
You know, but they were fired. They should have already been gone.
Well, Eunice Murray was. Norman Jeffries wasn't. I can't answer that question of why they stuck
around. I know. Okay.
And that is according to Norman Jeffries himself in the 1993 interview that they had. I could not find any mention as to where Pat Newcomb is at this point. I could not place her with Norman Jeffries and Eunice Murray at the market, nor could I still place her at the house with Marilyn, Bobby Kennedy, and Peter Lawford. I have no idea where her whereabouts are during that little time.
So we have no idea where she is between the time that she allegedly ate her either a hamburger or an omelet and
until here just shortly that we're about to talk about. She has about a 3-hour window where she kind of mysteriously vanishes, maybe a 2-hour window. She weirdly mysteriously vanishes from the narrative. So in this version of the events, when Norman Jeffries and Eunice Murray arrive back to the house, they find Marilyn in what Norman Jeffries says is, quote, a hysterical state, which prompted another telephone call to Dr. Greenson with a sense of urgency at this time from Eunice Murray for him to come over right away. So Dr. Greenson states that he arrived, this is his words, at the house between 4:30 and 5 p.m., which is corroborated by both Eunice Murray and Pat Newcomb, who's now back in the picture. There's a few reasons that Dr. Greenson gave for his visit to Marilyn's house that day, and all are from Dr. Greenson himself. The first one was Murray's prompt for the oxygen. That's the first reason he gave. The second reason he gave was in a letter to Norman Roston, who is a New York doctor as well as friend to Marilyn Monroe. Dr. Greenson states, this is Norman and his wife Hedda in this picture right here. He states in this letter, quote, received a call from Marilyn about 4:30 in the afternoon. She seemed somewhat depressed and somewhat drugged. I went over to her place. She was still angry with her girlfriend, Pat Newcomb, who had slept 15 hours that night. And Marilyn was furious because she had had such poor sleep. But after I'd spent about 2.5 hours with her, she seemed to quiet down. Now, that's the second reason he gives for going over there. Okay.
So he says he spent about 2.5 hours with her. So we know he's there from anywhere between probably closer to 5 if the phone call was made after 4:30. We know he's there until at least between 7 and 8.
About 7 o'clock.
Well, he said 2 to 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yeah. So it's 4:30.
We'll split the difference, 7:30.
Yeah. So, excuse me. And the third reason that he gives was what he told to Dr. Tabachnik, who was part of the suicide squad in the formal investigations. He says that Marilyn, quote, had been close to some very important men in the government and that she had been expecting one of them on that night. She called Dr. Greenson when she learned the meeting was off, to which he stated, quote, Marilyn died feeling rejected by some of the people she had been close to. That was his reason behind going to Marilyn's house, was because she was upset because she was supposed to see one of the government officials.
She was expecting someone. But based on these tapes, she wasn't expecting him and damn sure didn't want him in there.
Yeah.
Sounds convenient. Continue.
Yeah. So
the distraught damsel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So now we have Greenson at the house. He's given this therapy session to Marilyn in her bedroom that takes anywhere between 2 and 2.5 hours per his words, which would have taken him to being there anytime between 7 and 7:30, all the way to the end. Now, it's going to be safe to say that prior to the therapy session, once he arrives, I'm sure Eunice Murray briefed him on the situation that was going on. If it's the story of Robert Kennedy showing up and having this explosive argument, I'm sure he gets briefed before he walks into the room. During this extended therapy session, Eunice Murray states that her and best buddy, Pat Newcomb, hang out in the living room the whole time, which also, again, doesn't make sense to me, but whatever.
So we know that Pat Newcomb is still around.
Mm-hmm.
While Greenson is there.
Correct.
Even though we have missing time from 1 to 3 for Pat Newcomb, 1 to 4.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm assuming, I'm going to just go on and assume that she's at the house somewhere between that like 1 to 3 time period, 1 to 4 time period. Unless she went to the market with Norman Jeffries and Eunice Murray. That would be the only plausible thing of why she would leave the house for me. So during this therapy session, her masseuse, again, Ralph Roberts, calls and tries to get into connection with Marilyn. And it's about 6:30 at this point. And he says a man answered. And he only assumed that it sounded like Dr. Greenson. And he said he answered angrily and told him that Marilyn was busy and hung up. His quote is, "A man answered the phone. I knew it was Dr. Greenson. I recognized his voice. I asked for Marilyn, and he said, 'She's not in right now.' To which he says, 'I found that strange as to why her psychiatrist was there answering the phone if Marilyn was not home,' because that's the impression he was given. So he left a message and said for Marilyn to call him because he says she's not in right now." So he's like, well, that's weird. Psychiatrist is answering the phone and Marilyn's not home. But we know that they were having a therapy session in her bedroom.
Again, but wouldn't you just let it ring?
Yeah.
Why would you? Now that something wrong with that right there. Number one, he got no business answering her phone. It ain't for him.
Mm-hmm. So we get a glimpse into what was happening in this therapy session in a letter dated August 20th, 1962 to Dr. Marion Chris, who was Marilyn's New York psychoanalyst. Dr. Greenson wrote about Marilyn's decision to, quote, terminate her therapy. I was aware she was somewhat annoyed with me. She often became annoyed when I did not absolutely and wholeheartedly agree with her. She was angry with me. I told her we would talk more and she should call me Sunday morning. Now, the therapy session, in my opinion, only ends around 7 p.m. because we know this based on Joe DiMaggio Jr.'s phone call to Marilyn, which he also corroborates the time period of 7 p.m. He actually says that he called Marilyn 3 times that day, once at 1, once at 4:30, and the final time at 7 p.m. And the only time he was connected to her was at 7 p.m. The other times he was not. And both DiMaggio Sr. and Jr. state, quote, they talked for about 15 minutes. This is Sr., sorry. DiMaggio Sr., quote, they talked about for 15 minutes and Marilyn seemed quite normal and in good spirits. And the only reason why he knows that is because according to police reports, DiMaggio Jr. and Sr. were both together at the Miramar Hotel in Santa Monica whenever this call was placed. So now we're at about 7:15 at night after this phone call.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why was Joe DiMaggio Jr. calling Marilyn 3 times in one day?
Because he had very important news, and this has actually made Marilyn happy, was the fact that he had called off the engagement to his fiance. Marilyn did not like this woman, did not want him to marry her, and he was calling to tell her the news that he had called off the engagement, to which he actually says in a few interviews, she was delighted, she was happy, she was in happy spirits because of this news. So that was his reason for calling her.
So she's in a good mood there. Okay, at 7:30, she's in a good mood.
7:15, because he corroborates 7 p.m. is the phone call.
Oh, okay.
So it ends in 15 minutes, so it's about 7:15. Now, while that phone call was taking place, Dr. Greenson goes back into the living room where Pat Newcomb and Eunice Murray are sitting, and he looks at Pat Newcomb, and I always found this strange. He says something along the lines of like, aren't you leaving? Weren't you leaving? Were you supposed to be leaving? Something that prompts her to get up and literally just walk out the house, which Eunice Murray also states she found weird. And the second question was to Eunice Murray when he turns to her and says, can you stay the night? Despite seeing her belongings packed up. I mean, she says, I was packing my things. And he asked for her to stay the night. Now, according to Norman Jeffries, this prompted Eunice Murray to turn around and ask him to stay with her. And so go into Norman Jeffries just for a second. Norman Jeffries disappears from the narrative after Marilyn's death. And he's never interviewed by the police. Formally, sorry.
He doesn't give any interviews.
He doesn't give any interviews. Any contact that is tried to be established through Eunice Murray, she's very reluctant and has this sense of trepidation of trying to make that connection to allow him to be interviewed. And he is finally found in 1993. This is the interview that I keep talking about, in Russellville, Arkansas. And he's terminally ill and he's confined to a wheelchair. And he actually says, quote, I guess they can very well electrocute me in a wheelchair. And that's when he discloses that he never left the proximity of the Monroe residence. He remained with his mother-in-law from 8 a.m. on Saturday when he arrived for work until he left around 7:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. And he had been present during all the events that took place.
Why would he think he would be electrocuted for that?
I
guess they can electrocute me in a wheelchair.
In a wheelchair.
Why would he think that being present when everything happened would cause him to be on death row for something and perhaps be electrocuted?
Could have had some feeling of remorse that he was withholding something for this long. That could have.
Could it be he was threatened?
Blocked an investigation. He could have been threatened.
Could he have been inadvertently assisted?
I mean, he's confined to a wheelchair at this point and terminally ill. He actually ends up dying in 1994. I mean, he's very close to death at this point.
Okay, so continue on with what he says, that he never left. He in 1993, he says, I never left that property. We didn't go to the market. We were there for everything, 8 a.m. to 7:30 the next morning.
He says he didn't leave his mother-in-law's side. Now, they could have, because his own word says when we returned from the market. So there was a sense of them going to the market, but he was with Eunice Murray the whole time for 24 hours. He says that all that they did that night was they sat in there and they watched television in the living room was what they did. And of course, until they go to bed. So I kind of get this bigger sense of a picture with the individuals that are there on that night, particularly Pat Newcomb, Eunice Murray, and Dr. Greenson. I think Marilyn was cleaning house. I think she's letting everybody go. I think she had completely 100% figured out what was happening in her life and the people that were taking advantage of her. And I think she was firing the shit out of these people.
Yeah, she'd already told Greenson that he even says she is upset with me. She's going to change her therapist. She letting Eunice Murray go, getting rid of her. Yeah.
And my only one that is the speculation out of those three is Pat Newcomb. But based off Eunice Murray saying, no, it was a major disagreement, and Norman Jeffries saying it was this vitriolic, loud confrontation between Pat Newcomb and Marilyn Monroe.
It could have been.
I can only safely assume that Pat Newcomb's fate and future was the same as Eunice Murray and Dr. Greenson's, that she was freaking done.
That would be my assumption as well, because if it's somebody who's your friend, for me to get into a screaming match with a friend, that doesn't usually happen.
Right.
You know,
if Marilyn is hysterical at this point and we're trying to calm her down and all this kind of stuff, and the doctor's being called and he's coming over, that would give a legitimate reason for Pat Newcomb to stay on after lunch to see a resolution to this argument and potentially being fired, allegedly, by Marilyn. That would give me a reason to stay on. No, I want to keep my job. Let me see if we can't get to a resolution. I'm just going to hang out until after.
Or even, hey, that's my friend. She's really upset. I know she said, get out, I'm fired, but that's my friend. I'm going to hang here for a minute. I'm going to make sure she's good, and then I will walk away. But I'm going to make sure she's good.
Yeah, exactly. So Pat Newcomb does end up leaving. We see her around 9 p.m. She ends up going over to Peter Lawford's house, where she tells Peter, hey, Marilyn's not feeling well. She's not coming. So we place her from Marilyn's house. We know she leaves because about 2 hours later, she's at Peter Lawford's house at a party that Peter Lawford's throwing. And
goes to an associate of the Kennedys. So perhaps it was true. Marilyn was accusing her of being more on the side of the Kennedys than on hers.
Yeah.
But she actually confirms that.
Mm-hmm. But so if we stick with this time frame of about 7:15, 7:30-ish right now that we're working with, based on some of the a set of dinner guests at Peter Lawford's home, who is Joe and Dolores Narr. I know I'm throwing out a lot of names with no pictures. I was unable to find a lot of these. I was unable to find pictures of a lot of these.
So dinner guests confirmed that at
7:30, Marilyn called during dinner. And Lawford had casually returned to the dinner table and exclaimed, oh, that's just Marilyn again. But if you think back on previous episodes that we have discussed, 7:30 is the time that Lawford himself reports that he called Marilyn himself, and Marilyn's speech was slurred and she lapsed into unconsciousness, which gave the final quote of, say goodbye to the president, say goodbye to Bobby, say goodbye to Pat, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy, which prompted him to alert all the other ones. But we have dinner guests going, well, he just came back nonchalantly and like, oh, that's just Marilyn again.
So was she throwing a fit, and did he call her? Did she call him?
She called him. I think, if I remember correctly, that was the phone call for her calling him to tell him that she was not coming to the party. She was not going to make an appearance. Now, that is supposedly where Marilyn's phone calls end that night, because she lapses into unconsciousness and all this stuff happens. And allegedly, and they end up finding her body later on. What is interesting to me is that there are a bunch of people, trust me, a lot of people that claim to have spoke to Marilyn on her last day. Some don't have any validity whatsoever, but there are some that there's a little bit of validity too. One of them going back to Sidney Gilliroff for the second time that he spoke to her on Saturday, August the 4th. He says, quote, "It was between 8 and 8:30 that I spoke once again with Marilyn. She was feeling much better and met with her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, who I frankly detested. I tried to diffuse her anxieties about her argument with Robert Kennedy, and I think now that I totally misunderstood the situation. I dismissed it then as merely a lover's quarrel. We planned on talking again the next day, and I suggested we drive up to the Holiday Inn and talk the whole thing over. She ended the conversation with the provoking comment, 'You know, Sidney, I know a lot of secrets about the Kennedys.' To which he says, 'What kind of secrets?' I asked. And all she says is 'dangerous ones,' and hung up the phone." And he says that's how his last conversation with her went at 8:30. Now, Jean Carmen comes back into the picture at this point and claims that Marilyn called her again at close to 9 p.m. for the third time, asking her to come over, and stated that she had sounded nervous and afraid. And of course, she says she regrets never answering Marilyn's, request to come over. So around 8:45, while Marilyn's more than likely on the phone with Jean Carmen asking her to come over, that is when the call is placed from Mickey Rudin, Marilyn's attorney, to the house. Now, remember, Marilyn has 2 phone lines. She's got a private one and a public one. And all that they ask is, hey, they ask Eunice Murray, who answers, "Hey, is Marilyn okay?" That's that phone call, which she looks at the door, she sees the phone cord, she sees the light, and she goes, "Yeah, she's all right."
But never actually knocks on the door to check.
Never actually checks or knocks on the door or anything like that. But she had just called her to the phone an hour and a half earlier. She knew she was on the phone after the DiMaggio call, where she was happy and upbeat. So she didn't have any reason to be alarmed.
What time did that phone call come in?
8:45.
8:45. Is Marilyn okay?
And that comes from Mickey Rudin, Marilyn's attorney, to Eunice Murray, the housekeeper.
Why the hell was the attorney calling to check on her?
Because I believe, now this is speculation on my part, I believe that when Marilyn placed the phone call to Peter Lawford and said, "Hey, I'm not coming," Peter Lawford started to be like, "Why isn't Marilyn coming? She's not feeling good, da-da-da-da." And he's like, "I want to check on her." And his manager says, "Dude, you're the president's brother-in-law. You can't be doing all this shit around in here, being around her and all that crap." There is a call that is placed from Milton Evans, who is Peter Lawford's manager or agent, to Mickey Rudin's office, Marilyn's attorney, at 8:25. And that is logged at his office. That call is then placed at 8:45 from Mickey Rudin to Eunice Murray. And just, "Hey, is Marilyn okay? She's not coming." I can see the conversation. "She's not coming to the party. She told Lawford she's not coming. Is she okay? She feeling all right?"
But one time he says she's not coming. The next time, "Oh, goodbye, cruel world." Again, which is it? Stick with me here. I know there's a lot of information. He's the one that says she lapsed into unconsciousness at 7:30. The Nars, Joe and Dolores Nar, are the ones who say at 7:30 he came back to the table and said, "Oh, that's just Marilyn." Right.
So we have some contradiction to his story at this point.
Right. And now we're thinking it's Lawford that would have called Mickey and said, "Call and check on her," because the phone call comes in and says, "Hey, is Marilyn all right?"
And she's saying, Eunice Murray says, "Yeah, she's okay." And I think that was in response because Marilyn called Lawford and said, "I'm not coming." And he's like, "Just call and check on Marilyn." So right at 9 p.m., very close friend and dress manufacturer Henry Rosenfeld called Marilyn from New York. And he says that they discussed her projected theater party and stated, quote, "She sounded groggy, but that wasn't unusual." Now, this is where it goes from outside the household to across the street to a lady named Marilyn's neighbor named Elizabeth Pollard. Now, Elizabeth Pollard every now and then would invite a group of friends over to come play cards at her house. And on August the 4th, 1962, that was one of those nights. Now, when the first officer that arrived on the scene after he got the call, Jack Clemens, when he went back months later to the neighborhood to talk to neighbors to see if they'd seen anything, Miss Pollard is the one that came to him and said that she and her friends had noticed 3 men walking down Fifth Helena Drive around the nope, that's later in the night. Sorry, we're getting there. Anyways, and that one of them was Robert Kennedy, that he walked right past her window. She would have known it was him, and he had 2 guys with him. She had no idea who the other 2 guys were, but they were walking down the street. So that's what they claim. And it's probably about 9:30 at night that this takes place, because shortly after 9:30 p.m., Marilyn's phone rang again, and that was the Mexican director, Jose Bolaños. And he was her date to the Golden Globes in April of 1962. He states that they were having a conversation whenever Marilyn told him, quote, something shocking, something that will one day shock the world. That is all he gave in an interview after her death. He did not go any further into detail. It is not known what they talked about. But it was during this phone call that he said Marilyn heard a commotion at the front door. She set the phone down and she never returned to the phone. And that is shortly after 9:30 at night. Still taking notes, Miss Paralegal over there.
Yeah, I've got quite a few pages here. Yes.
Y'all better be ready for this live discussion. Damn it, Shelley's going to try and tear it apart.
So we know for a fact that someone claims to have been speaking with her at 9:30, and that could mean the phone could have rang at 9:20 and the conversation continued till 9:30, or that the phone rang at 9:30 and their conversation could have carried on until almost 10. At some point, because she had enough time to drop a little, ooh, I got a secret on him. So they had time to have a little bit of a conversation. So our window's getting more and more narrow. And then he says that there's a commotion. He can hear the commotion.
She sets
and
the
she
phone
puts
down.
the phone down, because then you couldn't put it on mute or anything like that. You had to set it down, and better hope that your mama wasn't screaming at you too loud to hear you were in trouble because you didn't make an A on whatever it is.
Exactly.
Your friends could hear all your business coming through that phone line.
Exactly.
If you didn't hang up the receiver back on the cradle. So she never comes back to the phone. Now, that's a bit of a point of contention for me, because I think that he would have stayed on the phone line. Does he ever recall? Because that line stays open unless you put the receiver back on the cradle. So does he leave?
To my knowledge, I had never found anything that says when he hung up the phone, if he hung up the phone, if he stayed on the line. All he said was
could have heard a commotion and thought, oh, well, hell, this is going to take a minute. I'll just hang up. She can call me back.
Could have.
That seems logical to me.
Yeah, he very well could have. Now, what ends up happening, according to Norman Jeffries, remember, who has been there this whole time, he says between 9:30 and 10, Robert Kennedy, confirming what the neighbor across the street says, accompanied by 2 men, appeared at the door, and he and Murray were ordered to leave the house. And they went over to the neighboring home. Not the lady who saw Robert Kennedy that night. No, they went to a completely different household. Jeffrey states, quote, "We were told to leave. I mean, they made it clear we were to be gone. But this time, Eunice and I didn't leave the neighborhood. We went to a neighbor's house. I had no idea what was going on. I mean, this was the Attorney General of the United States. I didn't know who the 2 men were with him. I assumed they were some sort of government men. We waited at the neighbor's house for them to leave." And it's during this time, that's the mysterious time, is when he shows up, Robert Kennedy, with these 2 guys, allegedly, between 9:30 and 10, as Norman Jeffrey states, as corroborated by Miss Pollard. And when Peter Lawford receives another phone call, because according to Joe and Dolores Narr, the dinner guest at his party, it was approximately 10:30 when Peter Lawford received Marilyn's alarming call, where she lapsed into unconsciousness, because he ends up calling Joe Narr and says, oh my God, basically, like, she's freaked out, or I'm freaking out. She's slipped into unconsciousness. Please go over there and figure out what is going on. I've tried to call both lines. Both are busy. Both are off the receiver with no conversation taking place per
that makes
operator.
no sense. That makes no sense, because we can assume that hers was left off the hook because we got somebody saying that she never returned. That makes sense. Why would the house line be off the Why would the house line be off the hook? There is no reason for that. The two people who could have potentially been on it, which would have been Murray and Norman. Tell me his last name again. Norman
Jeffries.
Okay, that's her son-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been the only two who would have most likely had some kind of phone call to make. Nobody else should have been on her house phone.
Mm-hmm.
So why was it off the hook?
Unless it was purposely taken off the hook.
That sounds like that's a reasonable answer to me.
Mm-hmm. So that's what he calls Joe and Dolores Narr and says, "Oh my God!" Essentially, this is paraphrasing Joe and Dolores Narr's version of this. He calls, "I'm freaking out. She's left in unconsciousness. Something's going on. Please go and check on her." What's interesting though is it calls back shortly after. There's two calls that are placed to Joe and Dolores Narr and says, "Hey, never mind. Don't worry about it." Basically, doesn't make sense, but what we know per Norman Jeffries, he states it was about 10:30, which would corroborate the time that Joe and Dolores say they received the phone call from Peter Lawford freaking out. When he and Murray saw Kennedy and the two men leave, they ventured back over to the house, and that is when they heard Math, who is Marilyn's dog, barking from the guest cottage with the light on and the door ajar. Jeffries states that they found Marilyn unclothed lying across the daybed. And he says, quote, "I thought she was dead. She was face down, her hand kind of holding the phone." That corroborates the 10:30 phone call to Peter Lawford. It didn't look to me like she was breathing, and her color was awful, like she was dead. Eunice took the phone and called an ambulance. Then she put through an emergency call to Dr. Greenson, who was someplace nearby. He did live less than a mile, by the way, and said that he would be right over. He told Eunice to call Dr. Engelberg. I went to the gates to wait for the ambulance, but before the ambulance got there, Peter Lawford and Pat Newcomb arrived. Pat became hysterical and started screaming at Eunice. I had to take Eunice into the house because she was a basket case. I think the ambulance arrived before Dr. Greenson. That is Norman Jeffries' account of what happened, which would make sense because we know Pat left Marilyn's house and went over to Peter Lawford's house, saying Marilyn's not coming, she doesn't feel well when she arrived at the party. So it makes sense that the two of them show up together. It's kind of interesting how that times out. What are you thinking?
I'm trying to figure out if Pat Newcomb went over and told Peter Lawford that she ain't coming. What was the reason that Peter Lawford takes a phone call from Marilyn saying she's not coming? He already knows this.
Well,
when he say, just tell her I've been made aware.
No, because Marilyn herself places the phone call to Peter Lawford's house at 7:30. Pat Newcomb doesn't say to Peter Lawford that she's not coming until 9.
Got it. Okay.
Marilyn is actually the first one to tell him. You're welcome. Clarification.
Just clearing that up. I'm not understanding why okay.
But it would make sense to me as to why Peter Lawford would call Joe and Dolores Narr back and say, "Hey, don't worry about it." If Marilyn's press agent was at Peter Lawford's house, Peter gets off the phone with Joe and Dolores Narr and goes, I don't know what to do. And Pat goes, "They can't go over there. If this is something bad, the press can't be. Nobody can know about this. Call them back and tell them don't come." That's a press agent and publicist's job. It would make sense to me why Peter Lawford would call Joe and Dolores back and say, "Don't worry about it." So
maybe. I think that Peter Lawford, the shadiest one out of all of them. But continue on. It's a fabulous story.
Well, these versions of events are corroborated by a lady named Natalie Jacobs. Now, Natalie Jacobs is the wife of Arthur Jacobs. This is Arthur Jacobs pictured here. Arthur Jacobs is a Fox Studio publicist, as well as Pat Newcomb's boss. Now, according to an interview with Anthony Summers, Natalie Jacobs told Summers that she and Arthur Jacobs attended the Henry Mancini concert at the Hollywood Bowl that evening, which is confirmed in this news article, Tuesday at the Hollywood Bowl. And I'm going to zoom in on a couple of places. This is dated June 28, 1926. And this is the line that's highlighted, Saturday, August the 4th, Henry Mancini.
Mancini. Henry Mancini.
Mm-hmm. Mancini, whichever one.
Mancini.
Is at the Hollywood Bowl. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah, you'd be getting a lot of hate on that. Henry Mancini.
Sorry, Mancini. My bad. But she says, quote, this is the conversation between her and Summers. She says, "I'll never forget that night because we were at the Hollywood Bowl and someone, I don't know who it was, that came to us. And all I remember is that we were no longer at the Hollywood Bowl, if you know what I mean." Summers says, "Yes. So when you think You heard the news and had to leave the bowl. And Jacob said, about 10:30. Would work into the timeline pretty well. Summers says, and then you left and went home and he went to Marilyn's place. Jacobs, exactly. Summers, right. Now, how does one account for the fact that the housekeeper is supposed to have called Dr. Greenson and he's supposed to have got in at 3:30 in the morning and found Marilyn lying dead on the bed and nobody else in the house except the housekeeper? And she is very emphatic. She says, that's not true because my husband was there. Summers says, yes, right, and had been there for some hours by this time. She responds, that's correct. Summers says, you remember the official story. Jacob cuts him off and says, my husband fudged everything off. Summer goes, ah. And Jacob says, and that, I cannot tell you why because he's no longer with us, as you know. Summer says, and he didn't tell you why she cuts him off again and says, don't forget that was his business to keep the press at bay. He kept everyone in abeyance. Summer says, okay. And he says, were you aware that Bobby was in town? She says, I think he was at Peter's house at the beach. And she says, yeah. And she hesitates and kind of stutters here. She said, yeah, that's what in fact, I must say, yes, I do remember that he was talking about him being at Peter's beach house. It's like she's remembering it as she's talking about it, is the way it comes across. And Summer says, right. And the conversation ends. So she is corroborating this 10:30, 10:45, this window between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, essentially. And we also,
that's the problem time right there. That's where we think most of the things that had happened to her had happened at that point, and shit was going sideways with her. Even though everybody wants to push it back, this one, the fact that they left a concert, which we know at that time had to end at 11 p.m. because there were laws against noise disturbances.
Correct.
Everything had to be quiet and silent by 11 p.m. So we know that they only had 30 minutes left in this concert. So this would have been a big deal to not see the grand finale of what you have sat through this 2 hours prior. It would be awful not to see the end. You're going to stay till the end unless something far more important pulls you away.
Major. Now, at this time, shortly after this, is when allegedly the ambulance shows up. And ambulance driver James Hall states that they were only minutes away when he and his partner received the Code 3 call to Marilyn's residence. And if I remember, Code 3 is lights and sirens. Hall ends up placing the hysterical woman at the scene as Pat Newcomb and also places Dr. Greenson and Peter Lawford on the scene as well. And he confirmed that they had found Marilyn in a comatose state in the guest cottage, and they placed her on her back on the cottage house floor in order to resuscitate her. And he says that when Dr. Greenson arrived, he ordered the men to remove the resuscitator and begin CPR, as he administered an injection of adrenaline directly into her heart in order to revive her. But he claims that the needle hit a rib, and you could actually hear the rib crack at that point. I don't know the validity.
What time is this ambulance driver saying that he shows up and he sees Newcomb, Lawford, and who else?
Dr. Greenson.
That's and this I thought.
So if it's 10:30 that Eunice placed the call,
and the ambulance driver were minutes away.
Minutes away. I looked up location differences. The ambulance bay was no more than at least 8 minutes away if they had to come from the ambulance bay itself. However, they said that they were minutes away, which that could be minutes. Well, they never said.
Well, they could have been, a lot of times the EMS have a certain amount of area that they kind of will drive, So, yeah. Okay. So
we're talking at this point. If they left the
bay, it was 8 minutes. That would be 10:38. If they were only minutes away.
Yeah.
And if they were only minutes away and the call came in at 10:35 and they were only minutes to me means less than 5. We were minutes away. I was minutes away from it happening. So that's going to tell me that either way, by 10:40,
ambulance is at.
That's right.
Ambulance is at Marilyn Monroe's house. So what I find interesting is one of the other ambulance attendants, Ken Hunter, was interviewed by the district attorney, Los Angeles. And the district attorney asked what happened. Hunter responds with, what do you mean? District attorney says, did you go into the house? And he responds, yes. District attorney asked, did you see Monroe's body? He said, yes, she was on the bed. And the DA said, do you recall whether she was on her back or her stomach? And Ken Hunter says, side. And he says, she was on her side? And he says, yes. Now, I know that's not a huge evidential, conversation, but I found it very interesting. He is literally the only person that ever states she was laying in a different position than just face down. Everybody else says face down in her bed.
And I'm going to tell you right now, on her side makes a hell of a lot more sense. You're talking on the phone. Yeah, okay. Even if there's a commotion, you're going to go, what in the hell is going on?
Mm-hmm.
And when you come back, you're going to kind of jump in about, okay, this is what's going on. You're probably going to go back to laying on your side if you get back in your bed.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're sitting up, and then you'll be...
So Anthony Summers actually got to interview Walt Schaefer, who is the owner of Schaefer Ambulance, which was the ambulance that made it to Marilyn Monroe's house that night. And Summers gets him on the phone, and he says, forgive me for troubling you, but I talked to Ken Hunter, who used to drive for you. Schaefer says, yeah. Summers says, and Ken Hunter said one of your ambulances was called. What, during the night? Schaefer responds, yes. Summers, do you know where it took her? Schaefer, took her to Santa Monica Emergency. Summers, now the reason that puzzled me was that according to all public records, in the end, she was dead at home. Schaefer says, no, she wasn't. Summers, your impression is she was alive, but presumably somewhat comatose. Schaefer, yes, that's right. Summers, I mean, you're quite certain you'd put money on it. Schaefer, yeah. And Summers says she was picked up, taken comatose to the hospital. Schaefer says, right. Summers says, and that was the end of it for Schaefer's, as far as Schaefer's was concerned. Schaefer says, it's the truth. And Summers says, but then it would have been between the two drivers, and Schaefer cuts him off and says, the other people involved. And he says, I don't know who else was involved. So I find it kind of interesting that you have all these different people. You have an ambulance driver, you have an ambulance attendant, you have the owner of the ambulance company that basically says, yeah, we had an ambulance go out to our house. On top of that, you have Mr. and Mrs. Abe Landau, who are neighbors to Marilyn Monroe, who state that when they arrived back home late on Saturday night, that there was an ambulance and a police car sitting outside Marilyn Monroe's house. So you have another person who is basically saying, I saw an ambulance at her place.
Here's the part I don't like.
Okay.
This Schaefer guy says that she was alive. Now, if someone has overdosed, you do turn them on the side in case they begin to vomit. That way they don't aspirate. Okay. So if she was on her side, potentially she had vomited, potentially. Even though nobody says that. And then Schaefer says he took her to the hospital.
But she doesn't make it.
Right. But if the ambulance was there, let's say at 10:40, the hospital can't be that far away, right?
Hospital's 10 minutes away.
So they give her an adrenaline shot. They do CPR. They put her in. They're not going to just be standing there doing nothing. EMTs are going to be moving as quickly as they possibly can. So she's probably loaded up and in by 11. Is that fair? 20 minutes? I think that's a long time. But if they had to evaluate...
I've actually got a short breakdown that's coming up that's going to give you a time by time that I've pieced together.
Okay, well, I'm just throwing.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
On what you've just told me. Let's say then 20 minutes is a long time, and so that means that let's say by 11 she's being hot-footed to the hospital. Why is everybody supposed to be saying she's there? She's in her bed at 4 a.m. and that's where we found her. How the hell does she get back to her house?
Which is what I'm about to tell you. So Anthony Summers gets to interview a guy named John Sherlock. John Sherlock is a writer and a journalist at this time. And he actually gets to interview Dr. Greenson. And Summers asks, he says, could you just summarize for me what Greenson told you and when it probably was that he told you? Sherlock says, Greenson and I were both at a lunch and I was sitting next to him at the table. And this is after she died, 64 or somewhere like that, quite closely related to her death. Summers says the question was whether she died in the ambulance or whether she got to the hospital. And as I remember, Greenson told you that, yes, she had been taken away by ambulance and that she got to the hospital. Isn't that right? And he says they took her to St. John's. Now, St. John's and Santa Monica Emergency are extreme. They're the same complex. roughly. It's kind of like having two really big hospitals next to each other. They just become, like Children's Medical in Dallas. It's multiple big, they're right next to each other. And Summers says St. John's Hospital, just recap it on it for me. Sherlock says, and that she died in the ambulance. Then they took her back to the house. That's what he had told me. Summers says she died on the way and the ambulance was turned around and brought her body back. Sherlock says, right. Summer responds, right. Greenson didn't say he was with the ambulance, did he? Sherlock replies very emphatically, yeah, he did. He told me he was in the ambulance. And that's my opinion about how the ambulance gets back to Marilyn Monroe's house with Marilyn's body.
That's the first time I've heard that.
I find it very interesting because
his name is John Sherlock?
Yes.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. Okay, he just gave me some information.
That is the time when the ambulance arrives back to the house and Mr. and Mrs. Abe Landau say, oh, no, I saw an ambulance and police car outside Marilyn's house. So there's one other thing, and I'm going to piece something together for you real quick. Just shortly before midnight on August 4th, 1962, there's an officer in Beverly Hills. His name is Lynn Franklin. He ends up pulling over a speeding Mercedes that's going east on Olympic Boulevard in excess of 55 miles an hour.
What time is this? Just after midnight?
Shortly before midnight.
Oh, okay. So we're saying in the, let's say, 11:45 to midnight time frame. That is shortly before.
Yep. So when he approaches the car, he sees inside Peter Lawford driving, Dr. Greenson, and Robert Kennedy, according to his statement. Now, I'm going to run you down something real quick, and I will say that the next sequence of these events are my own opinion. This is just based off all the previous statements that we have heard, timelines that we've heard so far.
And this is a police officer, documented
Correct.
Stop.
Correct.
So let's say let's squeeze it a bit. Let's say 11:40 to midnight. Let's give him 5 more minutes. An officer pulls over a speeding Mercedes that has Lawford. Lawford's a shady son of a bitch. I can already tell you. Greenson.
And Robert
Kennedy.
Mm-hmm. But you got to remember, Lawford and Greenson are seen at the scene. The ambulance driver places them at the scene. So this is what I'm going to build for you. If we're going off the events that an ambulance was called and Dr. Greenson's now spotted in this speeding car, and you have the statements from Dr. Greenson, Murray, Jeffries, Newcomb, Lawford, and Dr. Engelberg himself. I believe, because there's too many people that say that it happened, that an ambulance did show up and was called to Marilyn Monroe's house, that came and picked her up in a comatose state. And after an attempt to fully revive her at her house, they couldn't, and they loaded her up in the car and continued to try. Dr. Greenson in tow with them. Now, when Marilyn dies on the way to the hospital, I believe it's Dr. Greenson that instructs the ambulance to turn back around and go back to her house. When they arrive back to her house, the individuals there then found out that Marilyn was dead because Norman Jeffries states in his 1993 interview, quote, after that, all hell broke loose. It was horrible. I was in the living room with Eunice, and we could hear Pat Newcomb screaming, and we knew Marilyn was dead. There is not an exact time to that situation taking place, his quote, but we know it's after an ambulance was called. So we're going to be after 10:30 at this point. They're being told that Marilyn is dead. So now into the speculation of my own opinions based on geographical areas. I believe a call was made from Marilyn's house to Peter Lawford saying that Marilyn had died. And the first thing that Lawford thought of was, fuck, we've got to get Kennedy out of town. So if you time this out, okay, you have an ambulance that's called around 10:30 p.m. and then an emergency call placed to Greenson, back to back. Ambulance is just minutes away, but we'll give them the entire time it would have taken to get from the ambulance bay, which is 8
minutes.
So now you're at 10:38. As you previously said, they're going to have to act fast. They get in, they get her on the back, place a resuscitator. Dr. Greenson arrives, says remove it, begin CPR, administers a hot shot, load her in the ambulance, probably 5-7 minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and give them all the way up to 10 minutes.
Yeah, I've given them up to 10 too. I was giving them more. I was giving them 20 because you got Greenson over there trying to help, and that's going to slow people who know what they're doing down.
Yeah, but I think
and the fact that they allowed him to administer a shot to her, he should have never been able to.
Well, you got to remember the ambulances are different back then than they are now.
That is true.
A doctor, they're not going to be fully stocked medical mobile units.
They might not.
Right. So you got 10 minutes to pass there. You're at 10:48 at this point. Marilyn dies on the way to the hospital. They don't make the full 10 drive to the hospital. They have to
This
turn
is
around.
where my issue is.
Okay.
This is my issue. I have never known an ambulance take your ass back where you came from. Don't you either go to the morgue or to the hospital so somebody can officially declare you dead?
You got to remember the time period. Ambulances at this point are individually owned corporations or businesses.
I have still never heard of an ambulance taking your ass back.
If you have somebody who is an internationally famous star as big as Marilyn Monroe, and you don't want the press to be known that she's dead on arrival when she gets to the hospital. If your ambulance is being chased by press, your doctor is there. Her doctor is there and says, turn around, take her back home. We'll take care of it up there. Don't worry about it. I'm a doctor. I'll write the death certificate, whatever. These are just ambulance
And they just
drivers.
trust him?
These are just ambulance drivers, you know? So she dies on the way to the hospital, so they don't make the full 10-minute drive. And they have to turn around, they go back. 8 minutes both ways, so let's say 16 minutes at this point. Time at this point is 11:04. 5 minutes pass to get her inside or leave her in the ambulance. Inform the group.
Somebody's got to unload her. They can't just leave her sitting in there, right?
I mean, this is all the speculation. I don't know. They could have left her in there for a short period of time. They could have wheeled her right into the house, trying to figure out what to do with her body at that point. You know, I have no idea.
Well, no, she was wheeled out in full view the next day, so somebody had to have unloaded her.
Well, yeah, she gets unloaded eventually, but there's no telling. Should she sit in there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes,
You'd
half
have
an
to
hour?
do it under the cover of darkness. Because your nosy neighbor doesn't see the ambulance. So what's going on in Maryland's? You know they were paying attention.
Oh, I know, but that's what I'm saying. Like how long she actually stayed in the ambulance, I'm unsure. But what I'm saying is 5 minutes passes, you know, to go inside, inform the group, get on the phone, connect to the operator, phone Lawford, tell him that Marilyn's passed. But again, we'll give it 10 minutes for all that. So now you're at 11:14. So Peter, in a hurry, gets in his car, drives the 10 minutes to Marilyn's house. And by the way, I have timed this out. Drives the 10 minutes to Marilyn's house. And he's speeding because they got to get Robert Kennedy out of town. But we'll go ahead and give him the full 10 minutes. So at this point, we're at 11:24. Okay. So Dr. Greenson is there, ready to go. They get in the car, speed to the Beverly Hills Hotel, the full 17-minute drive. At this point, you're at 11:41. If it takes Bobby 5 minutes to rush, or it takes him 5 minutes to rush in, say, hey, we're here. Bobby comes down, gets in the car. You know, at this point, you're at 11:46.
Somebody's probably already called him and told him to have his ass downstairs.
Probably. Now,
now cut some of that off there. I don't want to give him till 11:46. I'm going to give him till 11:43 because I think he's waiting. I think somebody's already called him because from the time this has begun to now, just from 11:04 to 11:24, somebody's already called his ass.
Yeah.
The second Lawford knew, he knew.
So you get there, you get him loaded up. I'm going to stick with my 11:46 time frame. He gets in the car, even if it takes him to get to the edge of Beverly Hills on Olympic Boulevard, because that is where they are pulled over, is Beverly Hills. That is a 9-minute drive. Time is 11:55 or shortly before midnight, as stated by Officer Lynn Franklin. So it is completely plausible that Dr. Greenson and Lawford are both seen at the scene. When the ambulance leaves to take Marilyn, Lawford goes home. Ambulance takes her back because Marilyn's died. It is completely possible for Lawford to leave, pick up Greenson, pick up Bobby, and be pulled over on Olympic Boulevard shortly before midnight. It's 100% plausible.
And that is shortly before midnight.
That is shortly before midnight. So Norman Jeffries says that after all this happened, that all hell breaks loose. That's a quote. Quote, all hell breaks loose. There was an influx of individuals at the house, mainly plainclothes officers, that, as he put it, seemed to come out of nowhere. Now, full transparency. This is a massively contested detail in the timeline. As many either, I guess, can't believe or don't want to believe that a massive conspiracy would take place that would involve hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. But during this time, the neighbors, after they're interviewed later on, say that, yeah, during that time, the time frame of her being back at the house pronounced dead, that there was a helicopter flying overhead. Both Marilyn's house and Peter Lawford's house later on in the night, early morning hours. So you have neighbors that are complaining of a helicopter flying. So it's not just like it's one man that says all these people came out of nowhere. You've got this influx of people that are like, I heard a helicopter, that there were multiple people there.
Cars were coming out everywhere. There were plainclothes officers. It's not one person. This is the neighborhood saying this.
Right.
Pretty much.
Correct.
Okay.
Pretty
gotcha.
much. So you have a guy whose name is Bill Woodfield. He is a photographer and a journalist. And in the days after Marilyn's death, he begins to do his own detective work because he felt that like the press releases from the Suicide Squad, they weren't adding up correctly. And he gets and Anthony Summers gets an interview with him as well. And he says, Woodfield, in the middle of the conversation, he says, I don't want to go through it with Marilyn again because Summers says, I respect that the journalism that you did in 2 or 3 days, in which it appears to me no one else tried seriously to do or has done since. Woodfield interrupts him and says, listen, I don't know really anything else that I feel I ought to do. And Summers says, I would like you. And he interrupts him and screams and he says, Tony. Summers says, yeah. Woodfield, this has not had any interest for me in a long time. I went in, did my number, took my money, and got out of the business. Summers says, I would frankly like you on board in some way. Woodfield almost demandingly screams at him and says, find out where Bobby Kennedy was that weekend. Summers inhales and he goes, yeah. Woodfield says, we sort of started to piece together what happened. Press accounts were coming out and they didn't make a lot of sense to us. And so we started playing detective. I pieced together the notion that a helicopter was used and went out to see a helicopter pilot. And I said, can I look at your log? Have you got a log? And he said, sure. And he produced this log, and I started thumbing through it, and I saw an entry that said he took Kennedy to meet a flight en route to San Francisco. Summers says, and the time roughly is Woodfield. And Woodfield says 2 or 3 in the morning. We're talking about on August 5th morning now. Summers says, and apart from seeing the log, you mentioned it to him, and he said, yes, I did that. Woodfield responds with yes. Summers says, and he confirmed that he'd done that one that night. Woodfield says, yes. And Summers says, you called into the Herald Tribune, and they called back and said, no. Woodfield said, well, also a call was made to Bobby Kennedy's people. And Summers says, you were trying to get confirmation that he had been in town. And Woodfield replies, says, that's right, and that he had been at the beach house and that he had flown out. That was one reason for the delay. The message that we got back was that Kennedy would appreciate if we didn't do the story about the helicopter flight. And we decided that we would not go with the story. So the log corroborates a 2 a.m. pickup time at Lawford's beach house, which is also the time the neighbors are quoted in that area as the time they were awoken by a helicopter.
And how long is it from the time they were stopped to Lawford's beach house?
Oh, that's mere 20 minutes. So they have plenty of time to get to Lawford's beach house. And
so they get there, then they have to call somebody to get a helicopter. Then that helicopter pilot has to go to his helicopter, has to fly it over there. Yeah, that's you talking tight timeline, but it can be done.
Well, they had the in connection because Frank Sinatra was one that had a go-to helicopter pilot that he used for.
But you still got to wake him up.
No, I know.
You still got to get him to the helicopter, and he's still got to fly over there to pick him up.
Yep.
And he has noted in a logbook that he flew Kennedy out. Why would he leave at 2 a.m.? Not making sense.
Well, if they're racing back.
No. Just in general. Why would somebody?
Oh, yeah.
Why?
No, yeah.
And flying at night is very dangerous for small aircraft. I mean, most helicopters, they don't like to fly at night. I mean, you'll do a romantic city tour at dusk, whatever. Yeah, but they don't really like to fly at night.
Yeah.
Especially not then. God, way worse instrumentation.
Well, I believe that that's where Lawford, Greenson, and Kennedy were heading when they were pulled over shortly before midnight by Lynn Franklin, was to Lawford's beach house so Kennedy could be picked up by helicopter.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you at all on that.
Now, interestingly enough, about this plainclothes officers coming out of nowhere that's been heavily contested over time, Anthony Summers got another interview with a guy named Jim Doyle, and he was a senior FBI agent. And he particularly asked about the night that Marilyn died. And Summers says, as far as the actual records being removed, you were aware of that from your colleagues. Doyle, yes, right. Summers, this had occurred? Doyle, oh yeah, it did happen. Summers, right. Doyle, I was there at the time when she died. That part doesn't make sense to me. We'll get to that in a second. There were some people there that normally would not have been there. Summers replies, you mean bureau people? Doyle says yes. And Summers says, are you aware how long afterwards they came on the scene? And Doyle said immediately, before anybody even realized what had happened. It had been the instructions of someone high up, higher than Hoover. Summers says, schoolboy question, but who's higher than Hoover? Doyle says, the general or the president. Summers says, yep. And Doyle says, the only two. And Summers says, yep. The only thing I don't like that he says is I was there at the time when she died. Now, if he's talking about the fact that he was there and they were lying and waiting because they had gotten word that something was going on at her house, but my God, you're talking about having to act fucking quick. If you're overhearing that there's been a call for a code 3 to Marilyn's house, lights and sirens, I mean, by the time that they get back, we're talking about 11:05. I mean, you've got a window of about 20, 25 minutes.
Now, who is this guy that's saying this again? Who is this Doyle guy?
This guy named Jim Doyle. He's a senior FBI agent.
But remember, the FBI had her house bugged.
They also got, dang it, I always forget that detail. FBI had her house bugged, allegedly. So,
and he could have gotten there in the right amount of time. He could have.
It's very interesting that we talk about that because a third interview that Anthony Summers got, or another, I guess, was with a law enforcement informant. His name is Harry Hall. And he basically comes in and Summers says, I thought maybe I'd kick it off. This is the conversation. You said yesterday that you knew something about the events. Did you learn anything about Bobby's movements the weekend Marilyn died? Hall said, yeah, I had heard on good authority that the Saturday that this happened, Bobby had come into town. Bobby was in town and supposedly left. And when I say I heard it from a federal agent. And Summers says, can you tell me which agency? Hall says, yeah, it was definitely from the FBI. And Summers says, was it your impression there was any kind of FBI investigation of her death? Hall responds, not an investigation, but rather a hush-hush. And he goes on to say, because the man that really was involved was the boss. He was the Attorney General of the United States, so he could have the FBI do anything. People that knew that they didn't want Bobby Kennedy's name brought into this again because his brother was president. They had done everything to hush this up.
Sounds plausible. Now,
if we're going to continue with the timeline, because in my opinion, after you hear about all these above statements and these witnesses or the interviews that Anthony Summers and all these other people are doing, I don't think anything else matters after this in the timeline. And
I really don't either. I don't either because the rest of it is pure bullshit.
Pretty much. Because you have so much corroboration going on with all of these freaking people up until this time that
the rest becomes a government fairy tale.
But, however, let's just look at a couple of other things that just really don't add up with the remainder of the timeline. So we're going to set all that we just heard aside real quick. We're going to jump into time that it's when Eunice discovers Marilyn's body, if we're going off the original timeline.
Wait, the original timeline or the reconstructed timeline for the public's benefit?
Okay, there you go. We'll go with that.
Okay.
So... at first, we already talked that it was 12 a.m. then 3 a.m. We already see the huge difference.
Let's throw that out. Let's go with Eunice's story now.
Okay, we're going to go with Eunice's story right now. So the first thing that she says that alerted her was the light coming underneath Marilyn's door. Okay. And in my opinion, this really cannot be. A lot of people said that it was because of the thick carpeting. That was, I'm trying to find a picture of Marilyn's floor plan. I have it. I totally forgot to upload it, so I apologize.
That's okay. We showed it in another episode.
We did. But anyways, the way that it's stacked is it's Marilyn Monroe's room on the bottom and Eunice Murray's room on top. So you got two rooms on each other, and then you have the telephone room over here with a small hallway in between, and there's a bathroom. There's a bathroom up here for Eunice's room and a bathroom down here for Marilyn's room. Eunice says that it was that she had to get up to go to the bathroom. She saw the light coming underneath Marilyn's door. Now, she slept with the door closed. I have verification of that from something that she wrote. So, number one, how are you going to get up and see a light coming out from under Marilyn's door when not only is your door closed, but you have your own bathroom that connects to your bedroom?
Yeah, why would you leave your bedroom if you were going to the bathroom? Because I don't know, many people go traipse around the middle of the hallway going to a random bathroom when they got one right there. Yeah. Especially not in the middle of the night. Continue on.
Second thing, when it's pointed out to her that she could not have seen a light coming underneath Marilyn's door, she changes it that it was the phone cord that was running under Marilyn's door that alerted her that something was wrong.
And
Again,
people, you had to have a phone attached to the wall. And if you were really fancy, you had one of those great big long phone cords that you could drag all over the damn house. And apparently she was fancy because she could drag it all the way into this room. Again, that is not cause for concern. Wasn't that something that was typical?
that was very usual for her to make 2 and 3 a.m. phone calls to her friends. A lot of her friends say, yeah, she'd call. It'd be no wonder who was calling at 2 o'clock in the morning whenever my phone rang. It was always Marilyn. Marilyn was known to make phone calls between.
So again,
1
that
and
really
5.
isn't unusual. So, all right, continue on.
So when that is pointed out to her, she says then at that point it was her Piscean abilities that alerted her
what the hell?
something was wrong. Her Piscean abilities, and let me read this to you.
Wait, her Piscean abilities, like the
Piscean abilities,
astrological
like,
fish.
I was born under the Piscean or the Pisces sign. Yes, that one.
Oh, dear God. Okay, explain this.
In a book that she co-wrote with her sister-in-law, Marilyn, the last month, she states, quote, there was no reason I knew for waking. Number one, that's all already bullshit because she said she had to go to the bathroom. There was no reason I knew for waking, for turning on the light and opening the door to the hall. There was no evidence of anything amiss until I saw the telephone cord at my feet. I knew then that something was terribly wrong. The cord ran from the spare bedroom, which is the telephone room, across the hall and under Marilyn's closed door. There was no sound from within her room, and thick carpeting made it impossible to tell if the light was on or not. Cautious of awakening her unnecessarily, I did not tap on the door or call her name. Very much alarmed, however, I dialed her psychiatrist on the other line, end quote.
Don't you think she's going to be a little more pissed if her psychiatrist come over banging on the door at 3 a.m.? And you go, what the hell? Why didn't you just knock and say, hey, are you in there? No, that makes no effing sense.
But what also contradicts that is the fact that we had an 8:45 p.m. phone call from Mickey Rudin, Marilyn's attorney, that says, hey, is Marilyn okay? And she says,
well, either
yes,
way, then
right.
You suck. Because you should have gone and checked on her right then. And she says that she didn't because she saw the light on.
But
figured everything was good.
But here's my thing: is she's claiming her Piscean abilities alerted her to something was wrong. What the hell happened to her Piscean abilities 7 hours earlier? Did they just go out the window and 7 hours later they came back?
There was nothing wrong then, remember?
Shelly's winking her eye for those that'll be watching just the audio. So that in itself doesn't add up to me. About
suddenly she's getting visions. All of a sudden she getting, oh, I better go check. Ooh, y'all, for real. My Piscean ability is working. Get the fuck out of here with that shit. My Piscean ability, yeah. I got a Piscean ability for you. You a damn nuts, what you are.
So the other portion of this original story that I really have a problem with was the fact that Patricia Newcomb states she was woken up at 4 a.m. by a phone call from Mickey Rudin, Marilyn's attorney, that Marilyn was dead. Her response, as she says, was that she drove to Marilyn's house, obviously beating the cops there, as she would not have been allowed entry if they had cordoned off the house. But yet she was being interviewed by the second set of investigators that had arrived in the house. She's being interviewed in the house. So that didn't add up to me. But anyways, it's also the fact that her car was freaking missing. She drove there, but the following morning when she's leaving at 7:30 in the morning, she is getting in the car with Eunice Murray and Norman Jeffries,
who are now her best friends, apparently. Even though they were spooky and weird and not to be trusted. But yeah, I'll ride with you. No.
So that's the part that I don't understand. That her car is gone. Her car is not there.
Who owned the Mercedes that old Lawford was driving?
Peter Lawford.
Are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
Can we find a plate number? Because I
don't remember
where.
I don't remember where I found that. No, I don't remember.
It legitimately was his.
It legitimately was his.
Okay.
But what that does corroborate to me is Jeffrey's story that says that Peter Lawford and Pat Newcomb showed up together.
Arrived together.
Well, if that's the case, and Peter leaves after the ambulance leaves with Marilyn inside, he's leaving Pat at Marilyn's house. So the ambulance comes back, then all of a sudden, yeah, Pat would have had to been there, which explains why she's having to leave in Eunice's car or Norman's car, whoever's that is. I think it's Eunice's.
Even though
the following
Pat
morning.
Newcomb says, I arrived around 4 a.m. before the cops.
Well, she claims to have not been able to have seen. Let me tell you a little bit because we're going to.
Wait, back up just a minute. I'm a little bit confused. Tell me that again. Okay, so.
She gets a call at 4 a.m. from Mickey Rudin, Marilyn's attorney. She then rushes over to Marilyn's house. Now, the cops are called at 4:25. They arrive at 4:40. So She says that basically she wasn't there. She has no idea what took place, but she's saying that she got a call at 4 a.m. Obviously, she rushed over. She's going to have been there prior to the cops being there. And you have this now time of window between like 4 o'clock and 4:40. What's going on in this window of time that she's rushing to Marilyn's house? What she told, all this stuff. She's saying she wasn't there, but yet she's being interviewed by cops in the house who have cordoned off the house now once they arrive.
And we see her leaving, so she was there, even though she says she wasn't. Continue. Now I'm caught up.
Yeah. She says she showed up after she was told Marilyn died. But the final and last piece that contradicts her entire story is that in 2018, there's an interview with a private investigator named Becky Altringer. Now, Becky Altringer has been investigating Marilyn's death for the past 20 years, and she finally came across contact information from Pat Newcomb, who is 88 at the time in 2018, and is still to this day the one and only person that is in this circle of people that is still alive at 92 years old. She gets her on the phone back in 2018, and basically she's about to have the phone hung up in her face, and Becky says, I just need 1 minute. I just have to ask you a question. I just need 1 minute. And Pat says, you have 1 minute, go. And Becky says that 1 minute turned into 1 hour. And she says when she asked about being informed of Marilyn's death, Pat Newcomb stated, and Altringer says Pat Newcomb was very adamant that she had been to a party earlier that night. We know this, Peter Lawford's party, where she arrived and announced Marilyn's not coming, she's not feeling well. And after she got home, she received a phone call at 1:30 in the morning stating that Marilyn's dead. And Becky says, quote, she had it so down. She says, a quote from Pat, quote, yeah, I received a call at 1:30 a.m. in the morning. Marilyn was dead. I was upset because my friend was dead and I never saw a dead body. That's a little interesting to me because the only way Pat could have seen Marilyn's body dead laying on the bed is if she had been there, again, before the police were called and arrived.
Before the ambulance arrived, because they loaded her up. I don't think they ever put her back in her bed, which is why Eunice Murray was doing laundry the next day. And sheets were being washed because Marilyn had died on it. They had put her on the stretcher and they had to have taken her out of the ambulance at some point because they're wheeling her back out later. I don't think they ever took her back. I don't think they ever put her back on the bed. That's ridiculous.
This is basically what I've kind of pieced together here. I'm gonna give my own opinion and speculation at this point. If you think about it for a second, it kind of comes into focus. Marilyn's brought back to the house after she dies in an ambulance. She lays on a gurney or lays somewhere for a short time before this plan is to lay her in her bed face down. That explains the dual validity on her back. Because she's dead, so by livor mortis standards, the blood is starting to pool on her back because she's laying on her back. Well, if she is moved to face down within the first 30 minutes to an hour of her dying, she's going to have a bigger dual avidity on the front side because that's where the blood's going to pool in.
Why would it not be first that she might have potentially become deceased on her stomach and then rolled to her back? Because she was alive when she was put in the ambulance. That's right. Never mind. Go ahead with your bad stuff. I'm with you again.
So if you follow it to where, some time passes, she's laid on her back. Now they hatch this plan. They lay her in bed. She's nude already. They set the scene. They clean the scene up. They stage it to look like a suicide. Pat Newcomb could have been called at about 1:30 in the morning from the living room to be like, hey, Miss Press Agent, will you come in here and tell us that this is passable for somebody who has taken their own life?
Yeah, your syntax become, I can say, oh my gosh, Blake, I called you from over here. She might be letting people fill in the blanks on that and assume it was a phone call, when in fact you're like, yeah, they called me to come over and look at Marilyn. Yeah, they're from the next goddamn room.
Yeah. And this happens to be the first time she's seen a dead body. It just happens to be Marilyn. Now, I'm not saying that
which
is
might
what
be
happened.
Very truthful. She might be, and that's again, you sandwich a lie between two truths. It was the fact she'd ever seen a dead body, and maybe I believe that. I mean, but okay.
So, yeah, it's to me it sounds plausible because if you time everything out with the driving and all of that stuff after she's dead, get Robert Kennedy out of town, and then they come back and the ambulance is there and they lay her in bed and hey, come in here, take a look. It all times out to about 1:30 in the morning if you follow the timeline on that. Now, unfortunately, most of what we could have known will never be known because, as I told y'all earlier, the phone records went missing from the night on August 4th. So we have no idea who she actually factually talked to in her final hours. When there was a Herald Tribune correspondent, Joe Hyams, he attempted to retrieve a copy of Marilyn's phone records, and they didn't exist. He stated, quote, I contacted a telephone company employee and asked him to copy for me the list of numbers on her billing tape. And according to Hyams, this contact stated, quote, all hell's broken loose down here. Apparently, you're not the only one interested in Marilyn's calls. The tapes disappeared. I'm told it was impounded by men in dark suits and well-shined shoes. Somebody high up ordered it. And later, a General Telephone Company security officer told Hyams, quote, there was just a brief time in limbo in the very early morning when you could theoretically get to them before they vanished in the accounting system. After that, they were irretrievable for days, even if J. Edgar Hoover himself wanted them. With the formalities we had then, no ordinary cop could have gotten to Marilyn's records until nearly 2 weeks after her death. But here's the thing. Here's a little connection for you. I'm not laying blame or anything. I'm just connecting some dots for our listeners. Captain James Hamilton of the LAPD his intelligence division was basically Chief Parker's FBI in Los Angeles. And Parker believed that he would one day replace J. Edgar Hoover, and he was told by both Kennedy brothers, allegedly, that he was their choice for that position. And it is Captain James Hamilton's former assistant, Lieutenant Marion Phillips, that says, quote, in 1962, Chief Parker took the file, Marilyn's file, to show someone in Washington, and that was the last we heard of it. Now, there's a rumor.
I'd like to see that file, and whenever you bring it to me, guess who's going to be the new director of the FBI?
Now, there's a rumor that brings Ethel Kennedy into it, that she had a friendship with Chief Parker and basically told him to clean it up, and that she'd put her name behind his for FBI director as well, if he did her this favor. Do me a solid, and I'll get you appointed. But not only did these phone records disappear, but so did individuals as well. Because in an attempt to interview Peter Lawford, Sergeant Robert Byron, who was one of the second officers on the scene the night Marilyn died, reached out to Lawford, but he was told by his secretary that Lawford was out of town and would not return to the city until a couple of weeks. And the truth is that this time he is in Hyannisport because the day after Marilyn's funeral, Peter and Pat Lawford, along with Pat Newcomb, fly to Hyannisport, where they stayed as guests of Robert Kennedy's for several days. And when good old Bill Woodfield learned of the helicopter landing, the guy who learned that on Santa Monica shoreline, he attempted to reach out to Dr. Greenson for an interview. Dr. Greenson refused to talk and ended the call by saying, quote, look, I cannot explain myself without revealing things I don't want to reveal. You can't draw a line and say, I'll tell you this, but I won't tell you that. I can't talk about it because I can't tell you the whole story. Listen, talk to Bobby Kennedy. And that's when the call was placed to Robert Kennedy's people, and the response was, don't run the story. That was that whenever that took place. Joe Hyams states, though, that he filed the article about Bobby and Marilyn with the Herald Tribune anyways, even after being told. Or I'm sorry, this is a different one. That was Woodfield that got the story. See, I'm getting them all confused. Anyways, Hyams files an article about Bobby and Marilyn with the Herald Tribune on Monday or Tuesday after her funeral, and they killed it. And it actually never ran. That's a direct quote from him. What's interesting, though, is that you have Hildy Greenson, who is Dr. Greenson's wife, states in an interview, Summer says, I mean about, for instance, that weekend when it had happened, when she died. Hildy says this sort of thing was not talked about. And his daughter pipes in, and Dr. Greenson's daughter pipes in and says, people of that magnitude. And Hildy says, yes. Also, he wouldn't want to burden me with knowledge that I would then have to hide. This is Dr. Greenson's wife that says that. In an interview with Danny Greenson.
So obviously she had already been burdened if she thought it was knowledge that would have to be hidden.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In an interview with Danny Greenson, Dr. Greenson's son, Summers asks him, but he never reflected any of that to you. He's specifically talking about the ambulance ride at this point that Dr. Greenson was allegedly on with Marilyn. And Danny's response is, yeah, I just don't feel comfortable telling you what he told me. That was the answer to that. So you have these people. That's probably the reason why they disappeared. Another one is when Robert Slatzer, Marilyn's friend, tried to reach Eunice Murray in the weeks that followed after Marilyn's death. He found that her phone had been disconnected, and neighbors had told him that she had vacated her one-bedroom apartment and left for an extended vacation in Europe, specifically Germany, France, Switzerland, and Italy. And upon her arrival back, she was able to live out a very peaceful life until her death in 1994. And I think that her trip to Europe was a way to keep her out of the press and to quit talking, because she keeps changing her story at this point. However, good old Anthony Summers gets a BBC interview with her while she's in Europe. No, I'm just kidding. It's not while she's in Europe. This is in 1984.
I was going, damn, this don't
I
don't let
know. I would have loved it if it was in Europe. But anyways, he gets an interview with her. I believe it was 1984, in which Murray states, quote, this is Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, quote, the Kennedys are a very important part of Marilyn's life. I wasn't included in this information, but I was a witness as to what was happening. And Bobby says, and he was there that day talking about Robert Kennedy. And Murray says, oh, sure. Summers says, that afternoon? And Murray responds, yes. And it became so sticky that the protectors of Robert Kennedy, had to step in there and protect him. And in this interview is when she left the interview and thought that the mic was off, but it was still rolling. And she is overheard saying, at my age, why do I have to keep covering this up?
Oh, they just Robert Dursted her.
So not only that, after Marilyn's death, Eunice Murray disappeared, so did Pat Newcomb. Pat Newcomb mysteriously vanished. She had moved from her Beverly Hills address. She left no forwarding address. And when there was a contact at the Arthur Jacobs public relation firm to get a hold of her, Slatzer was told that Newcomb had been dismissed and was traveling abroad. Now, if we're going back to Becky Altringer's interview with Pat Newcomb 57 years later, back in 2018, she actually presses her on this, and I commend her for this.
Because that woman could have hung up the phone and heard any moment.
Yes, she could. Yes, she could. And I commend Becky Altringer for sticking this out. First off, she states, quote, Patricia Newcomb confirmed with me that, yes, Marilyn Monroe kept a journal. Whether it was a red book, she doesn't know, but she did keep a diary. Pat confirmed with Altringer that she was going through the drawers at Marilyn's house while the police were there. And that's a detail that's corroborated and widely publicized by officers, because they say that Newcomb was just this basket case going through the house. Rightfully so. I'll give her that it's because her friend is dead. So we'll give her the benefit of the doubt on that. Altringer presses her and asks if she was looking for the diary, and Newcomb flat out denies that she was. She says, no, I wasn't. But so the conversation.
I'll tell you what she was probably looking for. My speculation would be any kind of pictures between the Kennedys and Marilyn that perhaps were not public. That would be my thoughts. So she could very well be telling you the truth, or she wasn't looking for no damn diary. She was making sure all the pictures were out before somebody said, oh, let's put this in evidence.
Very true. Very true. So
because that's what you do. Your best friend, you got a porn buddy.
You're
they
also
go through,
the
get everything in print.
Yes,
that's what it is. You should always have a porn buddy.
Yes,
Whenever you die, they know all your passwords. You go in, and if you got to go dump that hard drive and beat it with a hammer and chunk it in your tank at your farm, gosh, that just revealed a little too much information. Then that's what you do.
You don't ask questions. You go empty the nightstand drawer. You don't ask questions.
Right.
Put it in a box and burn it.
You just dump and you go. So perhaps Pat Newcomb was Marilyn Monroe's buddy. In that case, if anything happened to me, you go in this drawer, you get this, you go to this, you get this, get all this out of here.
Yeah. So the conversation quickly turns to Newcomb's extended stay overseas. When Newcomb states, quote, I lost my friend. I was upset and I left the country. And Becky says, I asked her, did the Kennedys send you out of the country? And Newcomb's response was, I was leaving anyways. It's funny that she doesn't say no.
She doesn't deny it. Mm-hmm. I was leaving anyway.
Mm-hmm.
See, she doesn't confirm it. She doesn't deny it. She says, I was leaving anyway. That's when somebody goes, get out. I was leaving anyway.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, though, is that when she gets back are the jobs that she secured whenever she returned home. First one being liaison officer of the United States Information Agency. Second, a liaison between Hollywood and the Capitol. Then she got a position on Bobby Kennedy's campaign. And finally, a higher senior position at MGM Studios for an assistant to one of the executives, or a publicist or assistant to one of the executives. And God bless Becky Altringer. She pressed her on it. She was like, yeah, but you were always taken care of. And Newcomb came back and said, quote, I have a career in it. That's how I got the job.
She's not wrong. She did have a hit with the most famous celebrity in the world at the time. She would have been well sought after. However, that little political connection did not hurt her.
Right.
Let's go with that.
The most damning thing that she says in the entire interview with Becky Altringer is that Becky asks Patricia Newcomb, do you believe that Marilyn Monroe committed suicide? And Pat, she says, was adamant and vehemently said, no, I do not. And when she asked, do you believe that Robert Kennedy killed Marilyn Monroe? Chills went down my spine when she said Pat Newcomb's response was, I hope not. Not yes, not no. Just, I hope not.
But she knows for a fact her friend would not have killed herself because, you know, your best friend, you know things ain't right with them. And they may be a little squirrely, but you know if they're suicide. Your best friend in the world. Yeah. You know that.
Yeah. So Becky...
most of the time you know that.
Yeah.
You know?
So Becky ends that conversation with Pat Newcomb. But throughout all her research, it led her to, UCLA, where there are many boxes of Dr. Greenson's there in storage. And she requested to view all of them. And she got all of them except 4. The 4 that she did not get, she was unable to view the contents because they are taped and sealed into the year 2039, which is 77 years after Marilyn Monroe's death. What she was able to view in the other, I think it was 4 other boxes, everything in all other 4 boxes had to do with Marilyn Monroe. It was notes on Marilyn Monroe, pictures of Marilyn Monroe, life stories that Marilyn Monroe had told him. The generic
bullshit you could have pulled out of Life magazine.
Yeah. And so it's just a wonder what are in these other boxes. Now, Becky went through the whole thing of like threatening to sue to get these boxes open, and she still could not get these boxes. She went through litigation to get them open and was unsuccessful in doing so. I think that Dr. Greenson wanted to make sure that every key eyewitness and powerful player was dead when they were unsealed.
So that no one can contest the timeline.
And there's only one that's remaining, and that's Pat Newcomb at 92 years old. That is all the inconsistencies and new revelations.
Can we get to the live discussion already? Can we get to the live discussion already?
I was able to find. So that is for this episode. Now, next week, what we're going to do, we've got one more week and then the live discussion. Next week, what we're going to do, I'm going to feed into the other theorist side of it. We're going to take a look at Marilyn Monroe's life. We're going to look at the trauma that she endured most of her life. It's not going to be a happy episode. We're going to go behind the scenes as she reaches through stardom and all that kind of stuff and what was really going on mentally in the last 2 years. Because I think if we don't look at that angle, we're doing this a disservice. If we don't look at the fact that it could have possibly been her taking her own life, we're doing this a disservice.
We got to look at the side that we think is not plausible, but in all fairness, we have to look at it and say, is Correct. It possible that, right?
Correct. So that's going to be on next week's. But what are your final thoughts for this one?
Get me to the 6th one we can discuss. Just get me there.
It's going to be like all Shelley. It's going to be all Shelley. Well, we only got 2 more weeks. We're going to wrap this up. But if y'all enjoyed this one, make sure that you hit the little like button at the bottom, hit subscribe, make sure you're following along so you can see the live discussion. If you haven't watched the other 3 episodes, go get caught up so you can join in the conversation. But I just want to thank y'all for watching part 4 of the Monroe Files, the inconsistencies and new revelations that we have found. For myself, my name is Blake Smith, and as always, my very special, wonderful, special guest, Miss Shelley Pruitt, partner in the paranormal. And we will see y'all next week. Bye, y'all.